I never thought I'd be talking about demons so much as a progressive theologian. But here we are. Here we are. I don't think I heard that word once growing up in the Unitarian Universalist Church. And for good reason, I think we had. And in my mind, the word demon conjured up images of ancient myth and superstitious fears of forces that had more to do with human ignorance about the natural world or mental illness that was simply misunderstood. And then I suffered my own dark night of the soul. And it was in college, where I was taking some time off to heal myself. And one of my classmates said to me, "You better face those demons, girl, so you can get back to it. You can't let them get to you because you're too good for that." And I knew what he meant in a very literal sense, because there were no other words for me to describe what I was feeling. Because it was the first time that I felt what it meant to be overcome by forces that don't feel like they're coming from you. Forces that feel powerful and aggressive and possess your heart and soul. Forces that are dark and foreign, yet are turned inward and invade your sense of what is good by simply taking over your inner life. It was the first time that I thought, yes, that's exactly it. Demons. Demons don't look like frightening creatures that steal your body or wreak havoc in your home. They more often look like the lingering effects of personal trauma. And they can be quite powerful in the collective pain we inflict upon each other through embedded systems that deny the majority of people the right to live out their full humanity. They are as overt as the genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, but they are as subtle as the very real resentment that many American working class folks feel toward illegal immigrants because of a belief that those people are stealing their jobs. But though we're in a place in history where we are naming racism for what it is, calling out systems that we can finally identify as racially constructed, there are dark forces that I would argue preceded the issue of the color line and created a perfect breeding ground for its expression. And until we wrestle with the ancient demon that has possessed the hearts and minds of our social systems for millennia, we cannot move forward in our deconstruction of the myth of racial hierarchy. This demon that we must fight with all our hearts and all our souls is the myth that if you are poor, it is your own fault. This myth exists in some expression in every culture, but it has especially poisoned the soul of our collective American conscience. And it is abundantly clear, based on how we create law, that we are held captive by it still. From the first English settlers to take this land as if it was uninhabited, to our current administration passing legislation that continues to concentrate the vast majority of wealth at the apex of a very few people, we have long been possessed, so to speak, by this unfortunate cultural narrative that came first before any concept of race hatred was prevalent. To illustrate this point, let's return to some influential voices of early American power. Benjamin Franklin's writings on class revealed a man who embodied another mythical American trope, the self-made man. And yet he held a steely and visceral contempt for those who did not, like himself, rise in wealth and status. As one of the most successful editors of a major news publication, the Pennsylvania Gazette, Franklin's views reflected a pervasive attitude of class warfare that was simply a reproduction of the same class structure that existed in England. Thomas Jefferson wrote extensively on a model of breeding akin to breeding of horses or dogs that would keep what he deemed the natural order of human beings in their places. from those born with elitism in their veins to those he called the most abject, degraded, and unprincipled race. This degraded race that he was speaking of, guess what color it was? White. Yes. Yes. It was white. He was describing the white working class as if they were animals. Before he even constructed and wrote about ideas of enslavement by skin color. But even before the well-to-do so-called founding fathers imagined this country as an independent nation, the colonies of the American East Coast were regarded by much of England as a dumping ground for what they described as the human waste of London's slums. One writer, a clergyman named John Donne, wrote of the Virginia colony that it was akin to the nation's spleen and liver draining the ill humors of the body to breed good blood. This from clergy, and repeated by the likes of ministers from Cotton Mather to John Winthrop. Where on earth was the spirit of the gospel in the supposed new world? It was silenced by those who claimed to be spreading it, submerged by a powerful and evil class hatred that long overshadowed its alternative message. Long before the image of the welfare queen or the toothless redneck, those who were able-bodied inspired a deep contempt for the seemingly self-inflicted inability to rise out of poverty, which was spoken about as if it were a disease. It was called a plague upon the nation, some sort of external epidemic that pulled society down, as if society itself had nothing to do with this illness, nor any responsibility to confront it with compassion for those it affected. The first indentured servants and other enslaved white workers worked along the first enslaved black laborers brought on ships from West Africa. Dehumanization was an equal opportunity employer so long as one was landless, titleless, or motherless. And religion was a wonderful way to justify slavery in the old colonies, and not by the reason you might think, not because of the Pauline letters of the New Testament. Slaves, obey your masters, and other grotesque phrases. Not that, but by a convenient system of reward and punishment. You don't go to church, you could be fined, jailed, disenfranchised, banished, or enslaved. The utopia that the Puritans imagined had nothing to do with egalitarian ethics, but it did continue a long-held tradition of separating people by class and then using this human-created system to justify why some people deserved to thrive in comfort while others deserved to perish in poverty. By all counts, if this does not smack of demonic powers, I am not sure what does. A couple of weeks ago, I reflected on the theological entrenchment of classism in Hinduism with its caste system, a class hierarchy built into the fundamental structure of the faith. February marks the beginning of Black History Month, which leads us into the time to look backward in our quest to empower our spiritual journey forward. So to really get underneath the deeply entrenched cultural sins that continue to hold sway over our ability to live fully into God's dream, the beloved community, as King called it, I want us to dig deep this month. We tend to talk a lot during Black History Month about what W.E.B. Du Bois deemed the problem of the 20th century, which he called the problem of the color line, and he was absolutely correct. But also, as people of the God who challenges us to worship in the form of radical neighborly love, I believe we must interrogate the entrenchment of classism as a demon that works alongside and upholds the equally demonic power of racism in this country. So as I read our gospel selection for this morning, I kept pausing to wonder what Mark was telling us about Jesus' ministry in his obsession with healing sicknesses and driving out demons, and then declaring that this is what I came to do. If this was a large part of Jesus' mission, then the healings point to something bigger than what the text is telling us, literally, something beyond the narrative, to a deeper systemic darkness. We know that there was something rotten in the state of Galilee. Something rotten enough that all the town gathered for these healings, for these driving out of demons. Something underlying, something that no one else could touch, something so ingrained in the culture that it was taken for granted. And we also know that one of Jesus' biggest critiques of the world as he knew it was the abject poverty all around him and the dedication of empire in maintaining this economic status quo. It's all over the Gospels, and it's found in all 4 Gospels. So what if these demons that he was driving out included the demon of a belief system that accepted this world order as inevitable? A belief system that was so pervasive that the human suffering caused by a vast inequity in wealth was somehow untouchable, unchangeable, and perhaps even divinely ordained. The Reverend Dr. Tandeka, a Unitarian Universalist minister and theologian, whom we heard from earlier in our first reading, has long critiqued our conversations about race and racism around black and white color lines because of their lack of attention to class. What's ironic about Tandeka's writing is that she was one of the most prolific early writers in the contemporary public sphere to talk about the identity of whiteness. And she does this as a black woman. But as a black, highly educated woman, a minister in a primarily white, highly educated, traditionally male-dominated denomination, Unitarian Universalism, it makes sense that her approach to racism in America is atypical and unusually complex. Her focus on Darren Wilson's language about Michael Brown, his use of the word demon, reveals an analysis that is more than a critique of white racism. It is an examination of what it means to be white and what it means to be white and poor in the American context. And her curiosity leads her to conclude, quite astutely, that the identity of becoming white in a country controlled by whiteness, yet teeming with powerlessness on both sides of the racial coin, builds an existential shame into one's psyche, similar to the shame that is learned and integrated very quickly into the psyche of the child who is black and brown in America. But let me be very clear. This is not an argument that the pain of white shame is equivalent to the trauma of black shame, because it is not equivalent, and the two have extremely different outcomes. What it is, and what I think she is getting at, though, is an acknowledgement that there is a loss felt early on in a country with so little upward mobility for so many folks of all colors that drives both the subtle racism of liberal, well-off white folks and the overt racism of poor white folks who have lost something and are searching for that something, yet attach themselves with religious zeal to the very people who are keeping them down. Tandeka, from her perspective, thus is resisting the idea that whiteness is a privilege in and of itself because of the vast class disparity that has always existed and still exists today. I do disagree on this point based on a long history of government relief favoring poor white people over poor black people, starting with Reconstruction and up till today with the opioid epidemic and how our government is responding to that as it affects primarily poor white folk. So I disagree with this analysis, but I think that she wants to refocus the conversation here by making clear that race is still a device used by those who hold the economic power to keep a social system that continues to favor a very few people while everyone else suffers. If it weren't for racism, wouldn't the many more who cannot pay their bills have revolted against the very few who control the purse strings? Wouldn't those who were in prison with Martin Luther King when he sat there and the white prison wardens came to talk to him about his cause, and he said, "It sounds like you're just as poor as we are. You are in the same boat as black folk." Wouldn't it be true that they would, indeed, as he suggested, be marching together? It should be true. But once the controlling class saw that all it needed to maintain control was to create competition between white workers and black and brown workers, we were sunk. The false race divide keeps white workers believing that their enemy is the black and brown workers who are also just trying to survive, rather than the CEO making billions who decides to cut an hourly wage from $12 to $8 an hour. As Chandeka points out, this is the result of a historically ingrained sense of fear, coupled with powerlessness, that looks for a scapegoat in the wrong place, that grasps at a sense of belonging by believing that the one who looks like me must have my back. But in true, tragic, Greek, dramatic form, destroys both the fearful accuser and the victimized scapegoat. And the result, Nero fiddles while Rome burns. And this is nowhere as obvious as in our current crisis. A crisis where these same folks accept a founding president whose only credentials needed to be rich, white, and male, while they rejected a successful president whose credentials still had to surpass the most highly educated, morally pure, politically savvy white elite because he was black. It is nowhere as obvious as in the madness of an entire political party that abandons not only its moral integrity, its fundamental belief system, but its agreement to engage in factual discourse in order to bend to the will of this rich white man. When Rome burns as our government turns a blind eye to injustice, while factories continue to close and deportations of immigrants increase by 46% in 2017, when the rich white man insists that the poor white man's enemy is the immigrant, the poor black single mother, the Syrian Muslim, the Haitian refugee, the trans and gay and lesbian folks. Is this not a demon that must be driven from our social consciousness?
Yes.
We will not be free until we understand that this demon is exactly what it is. We cannot deal fully with erasing racism until we engage its link to classism. And we cannot fully engage our gospel call without engaging both. The wonderful thing is, we are not powerless. We are not powerless. We can resist the narrative that tells us that we are powerless. We can drive out the demons that tell us we cannot change this system by slow and steady engagement. Remember, beloved, we are not alone. And it is evident in the groundswell of local and national organizations committed to redeeming the soul of this nation. It is proof that there are more of us that thirst for a just society than there are who would give in to the lies of fear-based division. There are multitudes of us that desire greater opportunity for all, that recognize that our strength lies not in a Darwinian model of every person for themselves, but in nurturing and caring for those whose struggle is our struggle. I heard it this morning when Kim said, what's remarkable is that the majority of people who are marching against deportations are white. Older white people. That is proof. And I will not believe otherwise. There are equally as many who understand that the God who sent the Rabbi Jesus to heal the sick, to drive out these demons, is calling us into this vision of a world where fear is replaced by relief. True relief. Where we can breathe easy because everyone has enough. Such relief will come when we collectively decide that fear is that demon. Fear is not the antidote to healing ourselves and to healing each other. It will not come all at once, but it will come with steadfastness and devotion to doing what we can do individually as a congregation and as a community. So let us go forth, starting now. Let us make our connections to Children of Promise. Let us make our connections to Brooklyn Pride. Let us show up on February 10th. And let's decide where our ASBC funds are going to have an impact. As the Apostle Paul charges us, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not give up.